A few weeks after the petition for divorce was filed, but before our first court date, I went over to Cal and Melissa's house to see if I could get some answers to the question of how this whole thing started. Melissa had been Sherry's best friend in college, and I'd had known Cal slightly. Over the past few years, we had all become very close. Melissa had become as good a friend of mine as she was Sherry's. I realized, belatedly, that Cal and Melissa had not come to our house, nor had they invited us to theirs since the Vegas trip. Thinking of how Connie had spoken of Vegas, I wanted to see if Cal and Melissa could shed any light on the problem. They were outside in the backyard when I arrived. When I rang the doorbell, Cal came around the side of the house and escorted me back, handing me a cold beer before having me sit in the shade of a big pecan tree that was growing in the far corner of their yard. We sat for a couple of awkward moments. "So," I said finally. Melissa burst into tears and got up to run in the house. Cal and I stared at the door through which she disappeared and then at each other. "She's a little emotional sometimes," Cal muttered. "I know," I said, smiling a little in spite of all the pain everyone was feeling. Melissa was up front in everything she did, and I loved her for it. In many ways, she was closer to me than my deceased sister ever had been. I took a long swallow of Coors Finest. "Ron," Cal said at length, "Melissa and me are just as sorry as we can be that you and Sherry are breaking up, but we didn't know what to do, you know?" I looked at him questioningly. I could see comprehension spreading across his face. "You don't know," he said. I shook my head. He got 2 more beers from the ice chest beside him and handed one to me. "We didn't know whether to tell you when we got back from Vegas or not," he remarked sadly. "We thought that surely Sherry would tell you what happened. It couldn't be kept hidden, and after a while it seemed she had, and the two of you had everything all worked it out." "Worked what out?" I asked quietly. Cal took a deep breath and spent the next 20 minutes explaining how Sherry had gotten sloppy drunk the first night in Vegas. Tired and mad because I'd had to cancel at the last minute, Sherry had told the other 2 couples that if I wasn't going to be there when she needed me, she was going to find someone who would be. Sherry spent the rest of the night gulping down hard liquor while dancing and flirting with every man who caught her eye. At some point, Sherry and some blonde guy managed to disappear, even with both of the other couples trying hard to keep track of where Sherry and the guy went in the casino. No one saw Sherry until the next day. That afternoon, Saturday, Melissa and Connie had gone to Sherry's room and hammered on the door until Sherry finally answered. The blonde guy had been in the bathroom, but had come out. Sherry had been defensive, but also drunk and defiant. The guy had acted completely unconcerned about the whole thing. If you're enjoying my content, consider joining my Patreon community. By becoming a patron, you'll get access to full parts of my videos much earlier than everyone else. Plus, you'll be supporting me to create even more awesome content for you. Check out the link in the description to join now. He left eventually, but since Sherry didn't join Melissa, Cal, Connie, and Tom that Saturday evening, they were pretty sure Sherry and the unknown man had hooked up again. Actually, other than that one meeting Saturday afternoon, none of the 4 saw Sherry until late Sunday afternoon when she showed up at the airport to board the flight home. They hadn't seen how she got to the terminal, so they couldn't say her boyfriend had brought her. They hadn't cared. I didn't blame them. Melissa had come back outside wiping her eyes and was standing behind my chair with her hands on the tops of my shoulders. Every so often, she would pat me as one consoles an unhappy child. I'm not so sure that wasn't exactly what I was at that moment. When Cal finished, I sat looking into space. "I wish you'd told me," I said after a while. "I don't know what good it would have done, but some of the lying and the cheating might not have occurred." I sighed and bit my lip. But the damage had already been done, I guess. It wouldn't have made any difference in the long run. "How did you find out about Vegas?" Melissa asked gently. I craned my neck back to look up at her. "Y'all just told me," I replied. She was confused. "Well, how did you find out then?" she asked. I took her hand in mine and patted it gently. "I saw them in Sherry's car on the street a few weeks ago, and that blonde guy had his hand up her skirt so far I knew he had to have his fingers," I said tersely. Both their faces blanched. They winced in sympathy. "Oh, you poor man," Melissa said. "What a horrible way to find out." I shrugged. "I'm not sure there is a good way, Lissa," I said, "but it's over and done with now." I looked down at the grass about my feet, so I wouldn't have to admit to the sting of tears that had suddenly rushed to my eyes. Sherry had evidently come over to tell them of the divorce a few days ago. Melissa said Sherry had been mad as hell that Melissa wouldn't support her. It had been just a horrible mistake, according to Sherry. When Melissa had called her A and some other things, Sherry had left in a huff. That was my Sherry, all right? Blame everyone but the two people who committed the adultery. Cal, Melissa, and I talked for another hour or so before I left. Their 18-month-old baby needed attention, and I wouldn't have been good company at dinner, though they tried hard to get me to stay. 3.5 months into the negotiations, the question of the pictures I'd taken of Sherry and Blondie came up. Sherry was afraid I was going to put them on the internet. I thought their suggestion was a good one, and I started to look for a website that would handle them. I offered to send copies to everyone at Sherry's office and all her friends too. I didn't intend to do that, but it sure got the talks moving again. There would have been some legal complications if I tried to do as I threatened. For one thing, there was the invasion of privacy thing since I'd taken the pics through the motel window, and without permission from the motel or the participants. I told my attorney I'd go ahead and chance a lawsuit if something didn't nice happen real soon. The next day, Sherry's lawyer reopened the question of how to divide the house and offered me 60% of the sale price if I would turn over all copies of the pictures, but I refused. After a while, they offered 55% of the proceeds if I would agree to keep only one copy of the pictures and agree that I would never transmit them over the internet in any way. And, oh by the way, Sherry demanded a closed-door meeting between just the two of us. I made a counter-offer of 60%. I'd keep only one set of prints, no digital copies, and a maximum of 30 minutes with her. We eventually settled on the 60% of the house, 2 sets of the pictures, one for me and one, surprisingly, for Sherry, no digital copies, and a 1-hour closed-door meeting. They withdrew all of their motions before the court and agreed to a no-fault divorce at the earliest possible moment. A court order was obtained recognizing Sherry and I were no longer living together as man and wife, pending a final divorce decree. Texas does not have legal separations, and this was as close as the attorneys could get to one. It was fine with me. The sale of the residence and furnishings could move forward. The mandatory wait time for the divorce would not be interrupted, and things would be over in another 2 months. Meanwhile, I'd made a particularly strong effort to keep my divorce from affecting my job. In fact, I took refuge in my work. I was the first one to arrive in the morning and the last to leave that night. Maybe because he noticed my renewed dedication to the firm, the big boss made me the interim director for the R&D branch. He gave me all the problems to solve, but none of the pay increase for that position. I didn't care that much. I just made sure the disaster of my personal life never hurt my professional career. I got there about 10 minutes early. I'd hoped the traffic would be heavy and make me late, but it was not to be. The meeting between Sherry and me was to take place in a temporarily vacant office in my attorney's suite. I was hustled into that office and ushered me into the big chair behind the desk. That would have a considerable psychological impact on Sherry, they said. It would put her at a disadvantage. One of my lawyer's legal aides, the young woman who'd been so sympathetic when I'd initiated the divorce papers, fussed over me for a few minutes, straightening my tie and brushing at some imaginary lint. She leaned in very close to me as I sat there. I could smell her perfume, and if I'd let my eyes fall from hers, I'd have had a superb view down her open-necked blouse. When everyone else had left the room to greet the arriving party with my wife, she impulsively kissed my forehead and told me to hang in there, and squeezed my hand encouragingly. Standing, she turned and walked through the doorway, but she looked back and smiled before she disappeared. When everyone was gone, I got up and moved to a seat at the short conference table that butted up against the front of the big desk. I didn't think I needed any props or artificial barriers. My wife had committed adultery, I caught her, and I was getting rid of her. I didn't see things as any more complicated than that. When Sherry came in, she found me sitting there calmly placing 5x7 prints on the table of her and her blonde F toy on the hotel bed. I was going for neat rows of 6 pictures in each row, but the photos tended to slide on the slick tabletop. It was a lot of effort to make each line of pics to line up. I worked while Sherry settled herself. When I looked up, there was a flush across her face. She was an attractive woman, not beautiful in the classical sense, but more than just pretty. I knew that under the bulky sweater top and knee-length, dark blue skirt, there was a very exciting body. I looked into the face I'd loved for the more than 6 years we'd been together, 4 of them as a married couple. She'd been so warm and affectionate through most of those 6 years. Looking at her now, I couldn't say when the woman I used to know had disappeared, or where she'd gone. "You got me really good, didn't you?" she said bitterly, interrupting my train of thought. Her face was twisted into a mask of irritation, something I'd come to expect from her more often than not lately. "I'll bet you're so proud of yourself, aren't you?" I snorted. The puff of air moved 3 prints sideways, and I urged them back into place with a fingernail. "Nah," I said quietly. "You got yourself," I told her. I glanced up to see her still glaring at me. She opened her mouth to say something I figured would be spiteful. I beat her to the punch. "And no, I am definitely not proud of having caught you around on me. I thought the woman I was married to would never, ever screw some strange man. Exactly why would you think I'd be proud to find out differently, huh?" It took the wind out of her sails, and she sat with a blank expression on her face for a time. I held up my left forearm and checked my watch in as ostentatiously as I could.